Hi, I'm Kenneth Ortiz. I'm the Director of Online Education here at Bethany Global University. In this video, I want to teach you how to read a book. Now, I know what you're thinking. Kenny, I know how to read. I'm in college. Yes, that's true. But do you really know how to read a book? Much of the content in this teaching comes from this book. It's called How to Read a Book. It's sort of a classic from Mortimer Adler and Charles Van Duren, best-selling book, and is one of the most influential books of the 20th century. You can get free or low-cost versions of this book online. There are different websites that offer low-cost or free digital versions of it. Obviously, you can also buy it at anywhere books are sold. The number one point of this book is that to be an effective reader, you must be an active reader. Here's what the book says. The effectiveness with which the reader reads is determined by the amount of effort and skill the reader puts into his reading. In the book, the metaphor that the authors use is the game of catch. I don't know about you, when growing up, me and my dad would occasionally play catch. We'd throw the baseball back and forth, with the glove. Now, the person who's throwing the ball is involved in the most active portion of the game at any given time. It's kind of where the most action is happening. But can you imagine if the person catching just stood there with the mitt out and did no movement, no action, just sat back and waited for the ball to hit? You see, if you're not active, it demands that the person throwing throws the ball perfectly to you. But sometimes the person throwing, they're going to make some mistakes. They're not going to throw it quite right. So it takes some effort on your part to move the mitt, right? To shift, to catch the ball. The same is true in reading. If you are a passive reader, if you are not an active reader, you are like the person who just holds the mitt up and says, "You throw perfectly to me." And frequently we expect authors to throw their words perfectly at us, to write their books in such a way that everything is perfectly crafted with no errors. Well, that's just not feasible. That's not a realistic expectation for most human authors. Right? There are very few authors in all of human history who are writing in such a way that it takes almost no effort on the part of the reader. There are some writers throughout human history that are so brilliant, so amazing in the way they communicate and craft their words and articulate their concepts that it takes almost no effort on the part of the reader. But that's extremely rare. Most books are not written by people that have that ability. So it's going to take some active work on your part to catch what's being thrown at you from any particular author. That's the overarching goal of this book, is to help you understand that you must be an active reader or an active listener in the case of a lecture or a conversation. You must be active in that. It's going to take some work on your part. And this book then spends the bulk of its pages teaching you practical tips and techniques on how to be a good active reader. In this teaching, I want to just highlight a few of those tips and techniques from this book on how to be an effective, active reader. The first section of the book, How to Read a Book, talks about the different levels of reading that people achieve. The first level of reading is what we call elementary reading. This is being able to look at words and understand what those words mean. If you are struggling in your elementary reading, meaning you are reading chunks of books and are struggling to understand the words or phrases, I would encourage you to just jot down words and phrases that you're unfamiliar with and then go Google them. Go put them in a quick web search or look them up in a dictionary. Look up those words. And then one of the most efficient practices you could do is to then look those exact words up in a thesaurus to know what are all the different types of words, what are all the synonyms for that particular word that exist within the English language. This could be extremely helpful to you in expanding your elementary reading. The second level of reading is known as the inspectional reading level. And here's how the authors define that. This is the practice of analyzing a book before you actually read it. How to read a book, the authors say that we should first skim a book to determine whether or not it's even worthy of a closer read. This is a really important thing to do. There are times where you can inspect a book so thoroughly that you actually can get most of what the book is saying without actually ever reading most of the book. And if you're going to be effective in your college days, you're going to have to learn to how to be efficient. Sometimes your professor wants you to get the content of a book, but doesn't necessarily demand you read the entire book. Well, how do you do this effectively? You do this through inspectional reading. There are several things you can do that are part of this. Here's the first thing you do when you grab a book. First, you want to read all the ancillary components of the book. I want to read the cover. I want to read any endorsement blurbs that are in the back. I want to actually go through and read the table of contents. I really want to take some time thoroughly reading the table of contents, even if it's a simple table of contents. And I want to think to myself, what is that chapter probably about? Now, a lot of times authors want to be what I say cute in the way they name their chapters, and it's kind of hard to ascertain what it's probably about. But that's not the case for most books, and particularly in the world of education. The vast majority of books you're going to read, particularly textbooks, are going to have chapter titles and subtitles that are going to be very helpful for you to know what is in a book. So I want to read how many editions of the book have been. I want to read the title sections and go, okay, this book has been it's on its third or fourth edition. That means a lot of people have bought it. It means a lot of people have liked it. This book probably has some valuable information in it. I can continue to go through this. If there's a preface to the book or the introduction, you want to make sure you read it. Now, I used to always skip introductions and prefaces. In fact, several years ago, I had the opportunity to write a book, and I didn't write an introduction. I specifically told the publisher, I don't want a preface or an introduction. I want to go right to chapter 1. And the publisher said, why? And I said, because people don't read the introductions. They skip them. He says, do you read the introductions to books? I said, no, I skip them. And he said, that's a really bad practice, Kenny. You should read the preface and introductions to books. Well, ever since then, I've started to read all the introductions and prefaces to books. But a lot of people skip them. Maybe you're like me, you used to skip those. I would encourage you not to do that. I've corrected that bad behavior. So you want to go through, you want to read the preface and read the introduction. Most books that you're going to read as a part of your educational career, whether it's at Bethany Global University or somewhere else, most books that have an introduction are typically going to be well written. Typically by the end of the introduction, you know precisely what that book is about, and you know the primary thesis. Every book typically is going to have one thesis. That means here is the one overarching argument that the author is making. Here's the one overarching piece of information that the author believes to be true, is exhorting you to embrace. This is extremely important. You want to know what the author's thesis is because it helps you know the bent. The introduction or a preface or a foreword will often help you understand the clear thesis. So you want to make sure you thoroughly read that first. Then I want to skip to the back of the book. If it's a book that has an index, like this one does, and many textbooks are going to have indexes, I want to kind of peruse and think to myself, oh, what's in here? You know, I'm looking through the index of this book and I see, oh, look, Gone with the Wind is quoted. Grapes of Wrath is quoted. It looks like he's quoting novels in a nonfiction book. That's interesting. I'm going to go through and I can kind of just skim through the index. Look, Alexander the Great is quoted. Plato is quoted. Aristotle is quoted. I get to the end of the index and I recognize very quickly these authors are very well read and they are actually pulling from various genres of reading. Oh, they are probably not just teaching me how to read nonfiction books. They're teaching me how to read fiction as well as nonfiction. They're probably not just teaching me how to read contemporary books. They're also teaching me how to read books from antiquity or from the Middle Ages. Wow, that's good to know before I dive in. It's going to help me determine whether or not this book is worthy of my energy or not. Just reading the index and skimming it and asking myself, what is this book probably about? And just guess what you think is probably about. Chances are you'll guess right. Most people will guess accurately most of the time. Then what I want to do is I want to jump to the conclusion. If there's a conclusion to the book, I want to read the conclusion. What? Read the conclusion before the rest of the book? Yes. Read the conclusion. Know where you're going before you are on your way there. Read the conclusion of the book. Now, if the book doesn't have a conclusion, maybe just go to the last chapter and look at the last section, kind of guesstimate where you think the last section kind of is, and just read the last few chapters or the last few paragraphs or the last few pages, right? It's going to depend on the book. This book has two appendices, Appendix A and Appendix B, and has a very short conclusion. So I'm going to read the conclusion, and then I'm going to skim the appendices. I'm going to go, okay, Appendix B, it's got some sections. I'm going to read what the sections are. By the time I've read the table of contents, the preface, the introduction, the conclusion, by the time I've skimmed the appendices and the index, I have a really strong idea of what this book is about. I understand the thesis of this book. I understand the goal of this book. I understand the types of things I will learn from this book before I've ever even read it. The vast majority of students never engage in inspectional reading. I want to encourage you, do some inspectional reading. Now, once I've done that, I'm going to make a determination. Do I need to read the rest of this book? Sometimes the answer will be no. Sometimes the book is not worthy of being read. Sometimes the content you've been given from doing inspectional reading is more than enough. You can toss the book and keep on going. If you're doing a lot of research in particular, you want to make sure you are a good inspectional reader. If you're doing a major research paper where let's say you're required to utilize 8 scholarly sources. That's a type of assignment I frequently give my students at Bethany Global University. I'll say, write a thesis paper and use 8 sources. Now, what you can't do is go read 30 books to find 8 good sources. That's just going to be absolutely impossible. It's going to take way too much time. So you need to learn how to figure out, how do I identify good sources? To find 8 quality sources, you probably will need to look at 20 to 30 different books at minimum, maybe more. You better not need to read all of them word for word to figure out which ones are going to be valuable. Now, once I have done some inspectional reading, if I determine that I think this book really is worthy of it, then I want to kind of go to part 2 of inspectional reading. And this is where I'm actually going to begin to inspect the heart of the actual book itself. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to chapter 1, and I'm going to read until the thesis point has been made. And here on this book, I get to about page 7. So the first 5 or 6 pages pretty much makes its point. And I go, okay, great. This has reiterated or expounded upon the thesis that I've already learned. I get to page 7. Now the section is the goals of reading. Okay, now, got to be honest, I got to guess. This section is going to tell me what are my goals for reading. But I already know my goals for reading. The thesis already taught me that. Chances are I probably could skip this section. So that's what I'm going to do. And I'm just going to keep skipping until I get to a section that seems like, hey, that's something I don't know about. So I get to the section on page 28 that says, higher levels of reading in higher education. I wonder what that's about. And I'm going to read just these 2 pages right here. And then I'm going to continue on. And then the next section is the ideal of education. That seems interesting. I'll read that as well. But I continue on. I'm not reading every single section of the book. I'm simply looking for different sections, different subheadings, and then jumping in. So this particular section is the problem of comprehension. Well, I think I know what the problem of comprehension is. I think I have an idea of that. People don't comprehend things, or they don't know how to do elementary reading, or they're not very active in their reading or listening. So I don't think I need to actually read that section. I'm going to go ahead and skip that. But I'm going to get to the section where it's all about the solutions. Well, I may not know the solutions, so I'm going to jump in and actually start reading about some of these solutions. That's pretty interesting. And I'm going to read, and I'm going to read, and I'm going to read. And the reality is I could sit and read a book like this and go through the entire inspectional reading process all the way through the entire book, and then simply find great sections of this book that are probably helpful to me without actually reading the whole thing word for word. In fact, as a professor here at BGU, I tell my students which sections to read word for word and which sections they can skip. I don't want them reading the entire book word for word. That's going to take way too much time and energy. That's not necessary. I want them to do really good inspectional reading. I want them to understand the thesis. I want them to understand the main points. And I want them to walk away with a few things. So when you're doing inspectional reading, when you're done, the goal is to write down what's the thesis of the book, what were some of the goals of the book, and then what are some practical applications. Most nonfiction books are going to give you anywhere from 2 to 5 quality things that you can do to apply the information. And you want to write those things down. By the time you've read a textbook of this quality and this thickness, you really should have, again, 3, 4, 5, maybe up towards to 7 or 8 bits of information or pieces of application that you can then utilize. If you're done your inspectional reading process and you don't have a list of quality pieces of information that you think you could utilize in research, or you don't have a list of good pieces of application, go back and redo your inspectional reading process. If you use inspectional reading techniques in your educational career, you're going to get a lot more out of those textbooks throughout the courses that you are taking. One other thing I want to touch on is how to properly skim a book. It's going to be very important in your process of inspectional reading. Here's how I skim a book. When I open a chapter, I read the first paragraph, word for word in full. If it's a short paragraph, I may read the first 2 or 3 paragraphs, but I want to read a chunk. And then what I do is I simply read the first sentence of every subsequent paragraph. So if I've got a chapter's multiple pages, I'm going to read maybe the first paragraph, the first 2 or 3, and then I'm just going to read the first sentence. And I'm literally just going to skip. I know you're thinking, Kenny, are you literally telling me to skip content? Yes, I'm telling you to skip some content. You're just going to read the first sentence of every paragraph. Again, and if they are short sentences, you may want to read 2 or 3 sentences, right? But you're not going to read the whole paragraph, right? Just a chunk of it. You're going to read that, you're going to keep reading, and what you're going to be doing along the way is guessing what you think is in between. You heard me right, yes. I want you to guess what's in between. And a lot of people are very uncomfortable with this. Some people are a little more black and white, they feel uncomfortable. But when you're skimming, the goal is not to read every word for word. It's not the goal. The goal is not to read and remember everything you've read. No, the goal is to just get a general synopsis of what that chapter is probably talking about. Here's what you'll find. The more you do this, the better you are at guessing what's in between. There are times where I've read a chapter using inspectional reading methods, where I've skimmed it. Just read the first paragraph or 2, and then just read the first sentence of every paragraph, and then read the last paragraph. Make sure you read the last paragraph or the last 2 paragraphs thoroughly. Make sure you read that slowly. And I get to the end of the chapter, and I go, here's what I think that chapter's about. Here's what I've learned from that chapter. And then there are times where I've gone back and read that exact chapter word for word, and I didn't learn anything extra that I hadn't learned from my skimming process. Now, sometimes you're going to read a sentence, and something is not going to make sense because there was something presented in between that the subsequent sentences are reliant upon. So you're going to then have to go back and go, okay, this doesn't make sense. This is kind of out of the left field. Let me go backwards and read the paragraph before. And it takes a little bit of work. It's a little bit of an art form, but you can do this very, very quickly. You can get through huge chunks of books very quickly through skimming. So skimming is a big part of your inspectional reading process. Level 3 of reading is what we call analytical reading. Analytical reading is where you read things word for word, slowly, and you digest them. If you determine a book is really, really good and worthy of analytical reading, then you go ahead and do that. And this is the key to analytical reading, is reading it slow with pauses, and you ask yourself questions along the way. You're reading through the book, you read a paragraph, you pause, and you ask yourself, what did the author mean by that? Why did the author say it that way? Why did she articulate those thoughts the way she articulated them? Here's another question you ask yourself during the analytical process. This is a great, great question to ask. In light of the thesis, what does this paragraph mean? Or how does this paragraph back up the thesis? So let me give you an example. This book, the thesis is how to be an active reader. So I read this paragraph right here, and I pause in the paragraph and I ask myself, how does this paragraph help me be a better active reader? What in this paragraph will lead me to be more effective in my desire to be an active reader? I'm going to pause and I'm going to think. And then I'm going to continue. And I may go back and reread that section. That's analytical reading. Not just reading, but pausing. And it's really good to have a notepad and maybe just take a few notes, jot some things down. I love to just jot a quick question to myself and then quick answer it. There are times as you're going through your inspectional reading process, when you're inspecting the book or you're skimming, you're going to get to a section and go, oh, that seems really important. Let me backtrack and analytically read that entire thing. So I may be skimming and I'm reading and I go, that seems very interesting. I bet I could learn a lot. Let me backtrack and read this entire chapter analytically. Pause. Maybe the first time I read it through, just elementary. I read it all the way through, just simply reading, and then I go back and read it a second time analytically. I go, that's really good. Take some notes. And then I continue my inspectional reading, just skimming and inspecting different sections until I get to another section. Frequently, the best way to read textbooks or books you're assigned is a combination of inspectional reading and analytical reading. You are using inspectional reading to inspect the book, to find the sections that are most helpful to you, and then you're going to pause and you're going to analytically read those sections slowly, maybe more than once. You're going to think about the thesis of the book. Most people, when they're reading, they never do this. They never read a section of a book in light of the grander thesis. But the grander thesis is always the driving force of a book, and it gives you clarity that you otherwise would not have. There may be sections in a book you're reading that you don't fully understand. However, if you understand the thesis, it will help shed light on that section and make it a little more comprehensible to you. Okay, quick recap. We've got elementary reading, inspectional reading, and analytical reading. Now we're going to cover the fourth and final level of reading, and that is syntopical reading. This is a type of reading where you're able to jump in and out of books. Adler says in the book that whenever you're writing an essay for a class or you're working on a major project, it's never going to be based on just one textbook, right? Unless it's a book review of some sort. But in most cases, you're going to be using multiple different sources. Syntopical reading is the type of reading you will need to employ when you have multiple books. If I've got this book, How to Read a Book, and then I've got another book about textual criticisms, what I want to be able to do is read a section of this book analytically, pop out of this book, jump into a different book, lift that up, and find the section of that book that's similar to this one. So I'm going to inspectionally read this book, find the sections that are most applicable or relevant to me. I'm going to analytically read just those sections. Then I'm going to take some notes. Then I'm going to find a different book. I'm going to inspectionally read that book. I'm going to find the sections that correspond with the sections of this other book. So I've got sections from two different books. I'm going to analytically read just that. And I'm going to make some notes. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my notes from these two books, these two sections, and I'm going to compare them, and then I'm going to make some conclusions based on the information from these two sections. That's what we call syntopical reading. This book, How to Read a Book, gives several practical tips, in fact, dozens of simple practical tips on how to employ effective syntopical reading. Let me give you just a few things you want to do when you're doing syntopical reading. I want to compare author biases. I want to know, hey, what does the author of this book think compared to the author of another book? Let's say I'm doing a research paper on soteriology, and I've got one book that's by John Piper and another book that's by Roger Olson. Well, if they're both talking about the same thing, they may talk about it in a different way because they have different beliefs. It would be helpful for me to know, oh, John Piper is a Calvinist and he is pro the doctrines of Calvinism. Roger Olson, on the other hand, is not a Calvinist. He's a classical Arminian, and he has kind of an anti-Calvinist perspective. If they're both writing about Calvinism, they're not going to give me the same perspective. It would be helpful for me to know the biases, the pre-existing presuppositions of these two authors, and then compare the two. Whenever I'm doing syntopical reading, I want to highlight what are the biases of these two authors, and I want to compare them. And I want to ask myself, does the biases of these sections bleed into the words more or less? Is John Piper's words clearly influenced by the fact that he is a Calvinist? Is Roger Olson's words clearly influenced by the fact that he is an Arminian? Or is one of them seemingly less biased than the other? Now, of course, my personal bias is going to influence how I judge their individual biases, certainly. My subjective judgment is going to impact what I think about their subjective judgment. However, it's important for me to go through the process of thinking about their biases. I want to think about their goals. What is John Piper's thesis in this book? What is Roger Olson's thesis in this book? Do they match? Are they simpatico in some way? Are they helpful? If John Piper's goal in this book is to prove that Calvinism is right, and Roger Olson's goal in his book is to prove that Calvinism is wrong, well, they can be very helpful in my research project. But if John Piper's goal is to prove that Calvinism is right, and Roger Olson's goal is to prove that Arminianism is right, they may not necessarily be helpful to me in that moment because their goals are somewhat differently. They are both pro something, but the things they are pro are different. So if I'm writing a paper about Calvinism versus Arminianism, then these two books could be helpful. But if I'm writing a paper about the value of Arminianism, well, John Piper's book may not be all that helpful to me. Understanding the thesis, goals, and biases of an author through my process of reading and researching is going to be helpful to me. Many people read books and they never ask these questions. You need to pause and ask yourself, what's the author's goal? What's the author's bias? Why would the author say that? Why would the author say it that way? Why did the author not say it this way? And then here's another really important question you want to be asking yourself, particularly when you are reading multiple sections of multiple books. You want to ask yourself, what's missing? If I'm reading a section from a book from John Piper, and there's some things that he didn't mention that Roger Olson does mention, I'm going to ask myself, why didn't Piper mention that? Did he leave it out? Did he just forget? Did he not think it was important? Is there a subjective bias here that's informing this? Is there a nefarious thing going on? What is it? I want to ask myself, what is being left out here and why? Now, if you don't ask that question, you're not going to get the answer to those questions. And likely, you won't fully understand everything that a book is teaching. The best way to get the most out of a book is to understand things about the book that are not direct, clear, or explicit. There are things underneath that you got to do a little bit of digging on. And the best way to do that is to compare different books. This is why the process of syntopical reading is extremely helpful. I want to find something in this book that I can compare and contrast to something in another book. The best way for me to get the most out of this book is to compare sections of this book to sections of other books that are similar or comparable in one way or another. That's being an active reader, and it's going to amplify my understanding of what's going on here in this book, particularly when you start comparing authors one to another. The last thing I'll touch on is the idea of logic and cohesion. Many authors use logical fallacies. Frequently, it's unintentional. It's by accident. If you're not familiar with logical fallacies, I'd encourage you to do a quick Google search on logical fallacies. For those of you, obviously, who are students within the BGU ecosystem, at some point you're going to learn quite a bit about logical fallacies in our critical thinking course. However, if you're not familiar with logical fallacies yet, it'd be valuable for you to familiarize yourself with them. And when you're reading a book, you want to ask yourself, has this author done anything that approaches the realm of potentially being logically inconsistent? And you want to take note of that. Whenever you see an author using logical fallacies, it is likely because the argument that the author is making is not as strong as the author thinks it is. When you're able to expose that, notice it, you can then realize that argument is not as strong. You can deconstruct it, and you can pull the good things from that argument without necessarily believing the entire package. Look for logical fallacies, expose them, note them, compare them to the logical fallacies committed by other authors throughout your process of syntopical reading. Let me close with some words from Mr. Adler himself, the one who wrote this great book. He says, the key to absorbing and understanding any text, especially those you are required to read for study purposes, is to apply straightforward principles and simple techniques that involve active reading rather than passive reading. If you're going to be a great learner, you got to be a great reader. And to be a great reader, you've got to be an active reader. I hope this is helpful to you as you go on a journey to become an active reader.